Hello, my name's Jaden Chong. I'm one of the piano and guitar teachers here at Vincent Music, and I'm just recording this live from my own little home studio. And today, in this video lesson, I wanted to talk about a few little concepts. The first of all is how can one effectively maximize practice time, or even if it's in a limited span of time, if you're time pressured, how do you maximize that time? And the second one is mainly about things like wrist technique, which in some of my other lessons that I've taught through video, I have talked a little bit about. But it's through the combination of these two topics which I hope people do find useful. Now, the first topic in relation with maximizing time efficiency is, it depends on how old the student is. Some of the students I've got are very young, some are very old. But basically, in terms of time efficiency, the myth is spread around that sometimes people practice around seven or so hours a day. That may be true in some cases, but the fact is you don't do that consecutively. One, people need to eat, they need to drink water, because otherwise you just get dehydrated very quickly. And just put more simply, you don't focus. I've seen and also personally experienced moments where, whether it's myself or others, playing for like 3 or 4 hours at a time, but yet I feel or have felt personally that you just go nowhere, and others have felt the same and said the same thing. And the question is why? It's a very common occurrence even now to this day. And the simple thing is, if we're putting so much kind of inherent focus, actually, let me just give you an example. Say, for instance, if I were to be learning something such as, let's say G major scale, if I were to do that at around the same speed, at a very, very quick speed, simply, if I were to do that for around 3 to 4 hours at a time, doing it at the same sort of speed, then we're kind of not really going anywhere. If I would just do something 4 octaves, for instance. Now, for instance, there was a few little mistakes in there, and if I were focusing much more intently on that and still going at the same speed, I just find myself dragging behind, and more mistakes will be piling up. And while mistakes are important, at the same time, if we don't address the mistakes or otherwise go about it in a more kind of, lack of a more positive, endearing method, then nothing gets done. But if we keep doing the same thing and expecting different results, we're going to get the same results. So, how does one kind of slowly go past this? Now, in reference with distinct practice habits, it depends on how old the person is. For instance, with some of my young students, I recommend practicing only 10 to 15 minutes a day, maybe 20 if you're feeling a little bit, if you've got a little bit of extra energy on you. But half an hour to an hour in total a day sometimes. Because quite simply, if you're focusing on one, as I said before, if you're focusing on one thing all the time, and just focusing completely on that, whether it's learning a particular piece, and you're stuck on that one bit, and you go from the beginning, and then you get stuck on there, and you start again, and you go back to the same bit, you get stuck again. And it's that same thing of if you keep going and doing the same thing all the time, you're just going to be getting the same results. So, how does one go about this in a way which is more positively inclined? There are many kind of methods of kind of doing this, but the thing I've tended to find which works for me as well. Going about something slowly, first off, and I know that younger students might tend to have, maybe not necessarily not know what slow is, but kind of, it's that whole thing of, I don't like going slowly. Say, for instance, if you're learning F sharp major, that was quite fast. Admittedly, I'm not a fan of always going at that particular speed. You can do it, but the thing is, if you're just learning a particular piece or a particular scale, best to go slowly. First off, I like to do it hands separately first. Right hand on, and then left hand. Now, while I am comfortable with that scale, if you're not comfortable, or if you still needing a little bit of extra time, then go about that a little bit more slowly for the first bit, and And once you're starting to get comfortable with it, then do hands together slowly, even slower than the hands separately. And then start to speed it up a little bit. Let's change to something, for instance, like C major, because that'll be F sharp major is a little bit more of an advanced key, but the same concept applies. If we're doing just something like C major, same concept, just starting slower, or hand separately first. Maybe it can be 1 octave, maybe it can be 2. 2. And maybe it could even be 4. Let's do left hand 2 octaves, for instance. And now let's do 4. So, similar sort of concepts like that, even as I was attempting just now, not a perfect run, but it's also a work in progress. And with that, you might have noticed some of the actions that I was undertaking with some of my wrist, going back a little bit to the earlier topic of wrist. Now, how does one go about the wrist? Now, it is something that I have talked about previously in lessons, but the wrist is a very, very important part of doing things. Pardon the little finger crack there. As a good note, just leading on from that actually, always make sure to stretch a little bit, even if it's a little bit during, although preferentially beforehand, because it's very easy for your muscles and your finger joints to get very stiff. And also, just going to lean the camera down a little bit, stretch your legs. Because, quite simply, when you get to the more advanced forms of doing piano, I've just because of the keyboard at home, I've just got a simple, just a one little pedal thing. But with an ordinary piano, whether it's upright or if you're practicing on a grand, for instance, a grand piano, you'll have 3 pedals. And while they distinctly do different things, the far left pedal and the far right pedal, far left is our little pianissimo pedal, and our far right is our sustain pedal. Both are important, and in the later pieces, you're going to need to be using them. One, sustain for slightly more obvious reasons, but just simply to sustain things, you're going to be needing to letting go of the pedal, letting go, making sure that you're using those joints. Even if it's just a simple, I tend to use my top of the feet, close to the toes. If I use my heel, I'm using too much power. I don't need that. But when it comes to stretching, make sure that you give just a little stretch. If you're younger, you don't need to worry too much about doing a heavy stretch. It'll depend on your flexibility. Don't overstretch. If you overstretch, then it's actually just going to, your mind will basically tell you, okay, you're actually using these muscles instead of just stretching and preparing them. And there's a distinct difference there. So, for instance, if I'm doing something such as this all the time for if I'm doing that all the time, I'm actually almost using these muscles already. So it's the difference between using versus stretching and preparing to use. But with stretching, it's a very important kind of capability here. And now leading back to our wrist a little bit, we make sure that we kind of give some good wrist rotation. So, in reference with how one uses the wrist, it's kind of like a little pendulum wheel. When you think of the pendulum, you kind of think about that kind of 2 balls in the center here, but then when you move one, that's kind of what our wrist movement looks like. We move one thing up, and then we move it down. We move up, and we move down, we move up, and we move down. It's a gentle wrist motion. It doesn't have to be the most exaggerated thing. One of my music colleagues mentioned to me a while ago, in reference with this technique actually, is think about relaxing your hands a little bit like a jellyfish. Just going on one note. Preferably using your second or third finger on each hand. I'm using my right hand, for instance, here. Just sinking down and then floating back up like a little jellyfish. Sinking down, then up. Oopsies. Down and up, down and up. And this can be done with any one of the fingers, but I'm just using some of the others as an example now. Using my fifth, a little pinky here, my ring finger, my fourth. It's all just on the same note. Middle finger, down and up, down and up. Index finger, and our thumb. Thumb's a little bit more trickier to do, but same concept kind of applies. Now, I've mentioned some exercises previously, but it's just making sure that we make sure that we get a very good tone as best as we can. Admittedly, with a keyboard like this one, it's not always the most convincing because, I mean, it's not a real piano. It's just electronic synthesized sounds here. But in reference with how we can kind of go about doing some of these exercises, one of the exercises that I like to do, I'll see if I have the book. It's a book by Max Cook, and it's in relation with wrist technique and just making sure that we use our wrists. Because the reason why I talk about the wrist technique, and I used to be doing this all the time as well, is that in reference with wrists, it's so easy to just use your fingers all the time. This is what movement happens when you don't use the wrist. When you play that, for instance, when I played that just now, I found that my hands were very stiff. One, they were very stiff, and two, we're using a little bit more of those extra finger joints, which we don't necessarily need to always use. I mean, sometimes it's going to happen, particularly when we're doing some louder things. For instance, C major. I mean, for one, that was messy if I tried to do that, but the point still stands. And in reference with the wrist technique, what I've started to find is that you're still powerful, but you have at least a bit of a softer sound or a more rounded tone, because otherwise it's going to sound too staccato or too kind of sharp. And it's just too sharp. And it obviously depends on some pieces, but if you're looking for a piece with a much more legato tone, then you really, I would strongly recommend using the wrist rotation. One piece that comes to mind is the Pianoforte, I believe it was Series 2, the Japanese Koto. This one, I recommend having a really good look at my hands. I'm just going to adjust my camera for kind of rear view here. Just taking a look at the wrists. Kind of screwed that up a little bit. Similar sort of concept. I was just going from memory for that one, so it's not quite the most exact correct thing, but the point applies. Using the wrists. If we're sustaining something, we round off and we just move our wrists kind of in our motions here. An exercise which I had forgotten to do until just now, but basically using our two fingers here, fingers 2 and 3, I'm at least starting off with them. So before I continue the exercise, I'll kind of show you the utility of this one. So in reference with how I would go about this, it's use fingers 2 and 3, it's using your wrist motion. It's just kind of achieving a slightly more staccato sound with your middle finger, and your second finger is a much more of a legato or tenuto or sustained sound. That's one way to go about it. Another way is, and I'm going to do the same with the left hand. that's just one little example there. I'm trying to see what else I can really think of in relation with that. Just mainly making sure that when we're using our wrists, we rotate. So it doesn't have to be the most obvious rotation, and sometimes it's good when we start to make it seem a little bit more obvious. I wouldn't always recommend doing that. Don't move your elbow too much because after a while it does become tense. So when we're moving our wrists, it's just our wrists. Our elbows are just kind of staying. They'll move naturally. Don't force it not to move. When we use our wrists, let them guide you. And same with the left hand. So while I was a little bit quick, the motions that I kind of go for moving our wrist up, for our left hand, moving our wrist up, when we go up, and moving our wrist down. Down left, and with our right hand, when we're going up, move our wrists down up, down to go up. Well, that doesn't make sense, pardon me. Moving our wrists more, when we're moving right, we're imagining that we're moving our wrists again like that pendulum from before. And when we're going down, moving our wrists up. It's the combination of the wrist and the finger movement. Because obviously, all you need to use our fingers, otherwise we're not really playing piano. That's not quite that. So, I hope this lesson has proven useful for you, and yeah, otherwise I hope you have a lovely day, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.